Hello, everyone. Thank you for visiting my channel, Educational Norm. I work as an educational consultant, which means that I have the opportunity to interact and visit with many teachers across Ohio and beyond. Those interactions have driven me to tell their stories and their ideas on education. The goal of Educational Norm is to provide an informational network that focuses on positive aspects of education, the people preparing students for the future of our world. Join us each week for a new interview, and please subscribe and share the channel with others that you think may enjoy the program. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Educational Norm. Today we have Lon Smith, who is the Director of Student Services at Milan Area Schools. Is it area or community? Which one is it?
Yep, area.
Look at me, knowing a little bit. So he's the head of Director of Student Services, which is special education, 504, the MTSS, and Title IX, which I know a lot about Title IX, unfortunately, but it's a beast in and of itself. So on top of everything else, you have a lot of work on your hands. So welcome to Educational Norm, Lon.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I know your background just because we've been associated for so long. My first year of teaching was Lon's eighth grade year, and I had him in class. Uh, and we went through, Lon remembers me as a very emotional teacher, I'm sure, and an emotional coach. I've changed. I'm better. I'm much more calm. But obviously, that is something that he hasn't seen. So hopefully, we'll come across that way a little bit more. But Lon, since 1991, what has your journey been to get into the role you're in now in Milan?
Just going through, high school, trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to do. Not being the strongest student, academically at least. It was a little bit of a struggle of, do I want to go to college? Do I not? Um, I think at that time in the mid 90s, it was um, the push for everybody should go to college was kind of becoming a big thing or was a big thing. And so that would be where, I think society, if not teachers, friends, and certainly my parents were all pushing that direction. Um, and so I kind of settled on, thinking about going into education in some way. Um, Actually, had a average, or I guess maybe potentially above average, little football career in high school. Had some opportunities and a couple of small colleges, talking to me about coming and playing football for them. So that helped with making college look like a little bit more of a reality. I decided that Adrian College would be the best fit for me, and so I enrolled and went there. And for I think about 3 weeks of the first semester, I thought I wanted to be a math teacher, and I can't even understand why I thought I wanted to be a math teacher. I guess when you have a reading disability, you think math is much easier. But needless to say, I switched pretty quickly and majored in physical education and then minored in elementary ed, um, and kind of had the hope and the dream of being a elementary PE teacher. That was sort of what I would have described at that time as my ideal job. And to be quite honest, with 23 or 24 years into education, I still think elementary PE teacher is my dream job that I've never done.
I think we all do.
Um,
That'd be awesome.
yeah, I mean, it still looks like it would be a good time. Not easy, but a good time. Um, so I went to Adrian College, finished up there. Um, it's actually kind of I feel a little bit of a unique situation in that, um, everyone had kind of told me going into college that I was hitting it at the right time, that there was going to be this huge teacher shortage because there was going to be this massive bubble of teachers that would be retiring around that time. Um, and I don't know if it was a downturn in the economy or what, but that did not happen. There were very few jobs. I and also I don't know how if I also screwed up interviews because I interviewed for some and just never was offered one. Um, Went through a process of like just blindly sending out resumes to I think every public school within a few hundred miles of where I was living. I mean, there was no internet applications back then. There was a book you could go check out of the library that had the name and address of every school in the country, and I literally just printed out and hand wrote out resume or letters and email or mailed off resumes to folks. Few interviews, nothing panned out. The funny part is my mom taught for about 38 years, most of it at the elementary level. And that particular year, she was transferred from fourth grade to seventh grade to teach science. It was a week before school started, and she's in getting a room set up. And Betty Kohler was the principal at Blissfield Middle School at the time. And Betty knew me from doing some subbing, and Betty was a PE teacher when I went to school there, so she'd known me for a long time. Chatting with my mom, just like, oh, hey, what Lon end up doing? My mom just shared, like, well, he struggled, he didn't find any jobs, so he's thinking about going back to get his master's in special education to see if that gives him a better chance. And she's like, ooh, I'm going to give him a call. And so I'm out mowing my grass and I get a phone call from Betty asking if I want to come in right away to interview for a special ed position. And so I dropped everything, came in, met with her and Rob Stranges, who had been the special ed teacher, but was transitioning to become an art teacher that year. And we sat down and we talked for about 45 minutes, and she offered me a job teaching special ed. And I did not have a special ed degree. All I had was the 3 credit hour exceptional children's class that every teacher has to take. She offered it to me and said, do you need a minute to think about it? And I said, you're giving me a salary and health insurance? And she said, yes. I said, I accept. So about 5 days before that school year started in 2001, I became a special ed teacher with no clue whatsoever of what I was doing. But the fun thing is the room that I was given was the old home ec room where I had home ec when I went to there. And Rob became the art teacher, which was the room right next door. And so I was blessed to have Rob there mentoring me all the way through and helping me. And I leaned on him way more than I probably should have, but he was a great mentor in that. And so that began my journey. I taught resource room, 7th and 8th grade resource room that first year. I did ELA, math, and science. The next year, they transferred my mom back to the elementary to teach 4th grade again, and did some shifting around. And I ended up with, I think, 2 or 3 periods in the day. I was teaching PE. And then that's the remaining 5 years that I taught. I did a combination every year of resource room, special education, and then boys PE. So that was kind of my journey through that phase, if you will, of teaching.
Well, I'm going to stop you there for a second, just because there's so many things you brought up in that. Rob Stranges was an amazing person, but an exceptional special education teacher, because he was there when I was there. We actually started the same year. And what he would do with his group of kids was phenomenal. So great mentor, and I wanted to give Rob a shout out there. And I think one of the advantages of working in a small school is that you do get a chance to do a lot of stuff because you have to. So I'm sure you probably had more duties than just your class load at the time. What else were you doing besides your course load?
So I also had to teach a homeroom class. And so I had 8th graders that year doing that. I was asked to coach football. So like literally practice started the next day. And so I met with some folks that night and then started coaching football. I was blessed that particular year, Denny Thompson decided to step down from being a high school coach and became a middle school coach that year. So I was, Denny has definitely been a mentor, an inspiration, a father figure my entire life. And then, the opportunity to not only just work in the same building with him, but then, that first football coaching or, real coach, I'd coached some basketball and some other things, but that real coaching, the thing I love experience was getting to watch how he talked to children. How did he run drills? How did he interact? And so that ability to sort of learn from the best, working shoulder to shoulder with him was great. And then just, you're right, it's a small building, lots of other responsibilities. I learned you got to hang out in the hallway. My room, you walked out the door and it was the cafeteria. And so I quickly learned that if I was willing to sacrifice a little bit of my lunch, I earned some points with Betty and the administration if I stood out there and just meandered around some of my students at the time. And so I kind of started doing that and for the most part stuck with that all the way through the 6 years I was there, of just finding ways to sit in the cafeteria during lunch just to help, the Betty, who's called in 1,000 different directions, or whoever was the principal called in 1,000 different directions. And The poor one lunch aide that they would hire to supervise, 140 kids eat lunch. So yeah, it was things like that, along with just all kinds of other things. Sure.
Well, Denny played the same role for me when I first started in Blissfield. He was my mentor in coaching. He graduated from there in '68 and he's still around. Not as, obviously he's retired from everything, but he still has a presence in that building just
Yeah.
because of who he is.
Yeah.
One other thing before we move on to that next stage of your career, you mentioned you had a reading disability, which I knew of, but I wasn't going to bring up unless you brought it up. Um, what what is the diagnosis that you had, and how difficult was that getting through college with that reading issue?
So I had a specific learning disability in the area of reading fluency. And I had an IEP all the way from elementary school until when I graduated high school. That part of things was real for me. I was fortunate to have my mom as a teacher be able to advocate for certain things. And so I didn't really spend any time in a special ed classroom. Most of my time was in gen ed all the way through, which was good. It was mostly some accommodations and supports for things. Um, my reading comprehension was always very high. It was just that time. If you put me under a time crunch, I was the classic kid of, okay, everyone read page 4 quietly to yourself. And if page 4 was 4 paragraphs, I would be just finishing the first paragraph and everyone's starting to mumble and talk because they're done with everything. And so for me, that had an impact. I learned how to fake it. I learned how to not make eye contact with the teachers so they wouldn't call on me. Um, my mom gave me some wise wisdom at some point, I think around middle school. I don't think it was in your class in particular, but around middle school, of like, even if you don't understand, at least pay attention when the teacher's teaching, right? This was back in the day where the majority of time taught was sit and get lecture. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's just how it was. Which that's hard to focus on. I couldn't keep up with writing notes and listen and comprehend, read my own handwriting. And so I was struggling with screwing around during that time, is for lack of a better way of describing it. And then walking up to Mr. Potter and saying, "Can you re-explain this?" And rightfully a teacher being like, "Every time I looked up, Lon, you were looking over at your friend or your mouth was moving. No, I'm not re-explaining this." And so my mom gave me advice of like, try to focus, try to listen, but if nothing else, if the teacher looks at you, look like you're paying attention. Because if you at least look like you're paying attention, and then when it's all done, you go up and ask a question, they're going to go, "Well, you were trying. You were trying to listen. You were trying to hear." And I share that because that was some of the best advice I think I gave to my middle school students during my time teaching, when I would have those conversations with the classroom teachers where they'd be like, "But he or she is just screwing around the whole time." And I'd be like, and then the student would tell me, "Well, I don't understand." And when I go to ask them, they won't answer it for me. Again, it's human nature. I'm not blaming any of those teachers. We've come a long way in education. But that was the thing I had to tell this. I would tell my students, like, I know you don't understand what they're telling you. I know you can't keep up with the notes, but they're going to teach for 10 or 15 minutes or talk for 10 or 15 minutes. Stare at them. I mean, try not to creepy stare at them, but stare at them. Like, look them in the eye so that every time they look and they're panning, they see you looking at them. I said, and then when it's all done, if you still don't understand, you go up and ask. I said, I bet you more times than not, they will be willing to re-explain something or help you, because the perception you gave was that you were attentive and you were listening and you were paying attention. So now they're more likely to want to help you continue to learn. And I had, again, it wasn't, I didn't bat 1,000 with that, but most of the students would come back and say, "Yeah, that really worked." Or, "Yeah, I got a much better response when I asked follow-up questions or for more information," because they saw that I was listening. So
Well, since I
that would
had
be a
you
huge.
in well, since I had you in eighth grade, you probably started that prior to then, because every time you came up and asked a question, I answered it because I did think you were paying attention. Little did I know that you were just staring at me blankly and until I could do a one-on-one. And that's something that when your name came up in a conversation, I said he always asks a ton of questions, which is how I thought you were handling your reading issues, which was perfect because it does give that one-on-one time that is so needed for so many special needs kids.
Yeah. And those are the little things that I learned like along the way. So like to your original question of like, how did I navigate all of that? It was those types of things. And then, um, again, not that I mastered it right away in any way, shape, or form, as you and others can attest to, but like it's that fine line of being the student that makes teachers laugh versus being the class clown that completely derails a lesson, right? And like truly that's a skill. I think like I kind of I've always referred to that as sort of that's the used car salesman skill, right? Like you have to know how to get someone to be engaged. One of the best ways to do that is to get them to laugh with you, preferably not at you, but with you. But there's a line where it can become offensive, and that's hard for students in particular. But over the years, like that's where I had success, is I was able to build those relationships with teachers, and through that, teachers are humans. They're in it because they care about students, and so when they have that connection and have built that relationship with you, they are more willing to flex things, allow for other, ways of doing it besides the one way. And that wasn't that I didn't run into some roadblocks, but then again, I, unlike a lot of our students, was blessed with a parent who was an educator in the district who advocated for me. And so when I would come upon a roadblock with someone that maybe wasn't willing to be flexible and accommodate the things I needed accommodated, she would step in and defend me, and reasonable. All of the things were very reasonable things. Because as I would always describe it as there are very few careers where you have to be able to read something very fast, process it, and answer a question. Like, in grad school, I got in an argument with a classmate who said that someone with a learning disability would be a horrible doctor. And I lost my mind. I mean, it was probably the worst behavior I've ever had, and I loved grad school. But I went ballistic on this person because I'm like, really? I'm like, you're thinking, I said, you're thinking of a doctor that's on, ER or Grey's Anatomy, if that existed at the time. I don't even remember, but like, you're thinking of a fictional person that has, 47 things going on. I'm like, there are hundreds of thousands of doctors who do great, wonderful things in low stress situations that don't need quick answers. They have the time to think and process what's being shared with them and research something and give a good diagnosis. It's like, so being a slow reader has nothing to do with whether or not you could be a good doctor or any other profession.
Right.
So,
well, and
yeah.
I think
So
that's
finding those things.
I think that's a misconception with a lot of people that if you can't read well, you don't process well, and that's not the case. I could see, and again, going back to when you would question, I would give answers to you, and I could see you processing as we were talking. Uh, that whole idea that you can't learn and you can't think at a higher level has to be very frustrating. And I would imagine that's because you've had that firsthand experience. You can relate that very well to your teachers and to kids that you've worked with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that has helped me be an advocate for the students with disabilities. It's helped me navigate some of those difficult conversations to have with the very few. We are very fortunate nowadays. There are very, very few teachers left that think children with disabilities are limited in those areas. Now, yes, they are an individual that has a disability, so there might be limitations, but they're not universal to every student that has an IEP. Every student is the I in IEP. They are all individuals who all have different needs, and so they're going to achieve things differently. But that doesn't mean there are certain things, hey, this student has autism, that means they can never be X, Y, or Z. It's like, no, that there may be students with autism that can't be X, Y, and Z because of the severity of their disability and where their skills are. But there are also students with autism that can be X, Y, or Z and
Mm-hmm.
can be even good at X, Y, and Z because of their autism. So,
Well, the interesting you brought up the IEP because I wrote an article a few years back called "Let's Put the I Back in IEP," because at the time, as an administrator, I was seeing a lot of same accommodations and modifications And I could tell you before the meeting even happened what that was going to be. Rather than looking at the child, they just looked at the disability. And I think that's the problem with, and it's not as bad as it was, without a doubt. I've been in much better IEPs now. But if there's a student that has ADHD and needs movement, I could tell you beforehand what they're going to need just based on previous action. But is that the need of the kid? Maybe he needs PE twice a day. Do we take it that far when we start looking at IEPs? Uh, have you seen that in your career as well, where if you know the diagnoses, you can almost tell what's going to be said?
Yeah, and it's natural. The way I've always described it is it's I think it's human nature to want to try to make things as simple as possible or as uniformed as possible. And I think education is probably exemplifies that even more, right? We want everyone treated equally. Everyone has to have the same attendance policy. Everyone has to have the same expectation, all those different things. So I think that comes about from a natural place, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And so it naturally becomes, well, my experience has been working with students with disability X is that these are the 7 things they absolutely need. And I've had to challenge that or question that from both extremes, from staff saying this is what they need because of their disability, and believe it or not, parents saying this is what they need because this is their disability, or I want you to reevaluate them. I think they're now eligible for, let's use autism as an example. They're now eligible for autism, and once you move that eligibility, that opens up doors for them. And I've had to push back and say, what would those doors be? And the majority of the time, the answer I get is, well, I don't know. I won't know until you give them that label. And I've had to explain it as simply as there are X number of eligibilities, right? And they have specific criteria for being made eligible in those things. Once a student meets the eligibility requirement and requires specialized instruction and support, so it's a two-legged stool, if you will. Once they meet both of those requirements, the doors are now all open. Everything possible in the world of special ed is available to them. They don't need all of it, but nothing is automatically off the table. We have to have checks and balances. We probably shouldn't have a student who is eligible with a speech and language impairment because of articulation sitting in a cognitively impaired self-contained classroom off campus somewhere, never being exposed to gen ed students all day. That's an extreme that shouldn't happen. But at the same time, my argument has been your student is currently eligible as other health impairment for, let's say, ADHD or something like that. Sure, we see some autistic tendencies and we can definitely look at that. We want the correct eligibility. But the reality is, tell us what you think they need that we're not providing. There's no door that magically is going to be opened because we change their label to that. We're a little bit unique in Milan in that we're a full inclusion district. I have no self-contained classrooms. I only have a couple of resource rooms, and those are all at the secondary level for a variety of different reasons. And frankly, they're brand new for us at the middle school level, at least, to have or at any level to have resource rooms. In my 13 years here, we've been full inclusion. We have TCs that are the case managers. Our students are in gen ed classes the vast majority of their day. If they need breaks, they get the breaks. If they need a parapro with them, we provide the parapro to be with them. The TCs go into the classrooms and provide services. They'll pull them out in groups or individuals to provide services, whatever makes sense. But in Milan, special education is not a place. It is a service that is provided. So I haven't had to fight that battle as much as I know some of my counterparts that have a wider continuum of available services, which is good. I need to have a continuum. There are children that need resource rooms. There are children that need self-contained classrooms and all those things because that's the least restrictive environment for them.
Mhm.
But for me, it's trying to hit the broader range of student needs. And so I think that's where taking that individual into account is huge. And we do a good job here. And I think overall in education, we're doing a better job.
I would agree with that. And I'm going to apologize right now. It just said my internet wave is unstable. So if we cut out,
Oh,
we'll just call you back. And I can
okay.
edit, of
Sounds
course.
good.
That's always a good thing.
Yeah.
So, so tell me some of the positive things that you're doing in Milan right now in all those areas that you work in that are best practice and working well for kids and working well for your teachers as well, because that's very important is to have a complete picture.
You broke up a little bit
Of
if you want
course
to
I
repeat
did.
the question.
So the
Yeah.
question was, let's see if I can get it through this time. The question was, tell me about some of the best practices that are going on in Milan that you can stand back and go, wow, that's great. This is what our kids need. What are those things that are going on?
So I think we do a nice job of providing some early intervention services. Um, a little bit heavier at the elementary level, but we've also added them at the middle school level. And what's nice about that, and that's improved during my time here in Milan. And what's happening is we're getting the students the support, the additional support they need, so that we don't put them on an IEP when they just needed a little bit more intensive support in reading or math. So that's a great thing that we've done and continue to do, and continue to tweak and move forward with that. The other thing is we've done a better, no one's perfect, but a better job of trying to understand our students who are experiencing trauma or who have experienced trauma, and just getting staff to have an understanding of where they're coming from. You know, sometimes we know, sometimes we've identified, like, or it's been shared with us, this traumatic event or ongoing trauma is happened or is happening in a student's life. And so it's good for us to have some tools in our toolbox to be able to approach that in a mindset to adjust, because you do need to acknowledge that and approach it from a different way, than potentially another student who doesn't have that in their background, but maybe is having a similar behavior. It's not that you treat them any differently, if you will, but it's more, understanding the importance of building that relationship, right? You know, kids who've experienced trauma, they're used to being hurt. They were probably hurt by a trusted adult at some point. That's the statistics are there. And so they don't want to give up that control. The last time they, became vulnerable with an adult, the adult hurt them in some way, whatever the trauma was. And so they want to hold on to that. And so once you do start building that relationship, it's helping our staff understand everything was going great. We were getting along good. And then all of a sudden, one day I said one thing and he blew up and threw something at me and, mother effed me out the door. And we go, yep, that's going to happen. That means he or she was starting to get vulnerable with you, realized they were letting go of control. And when I can't do this, I got to take control back. I'm going to hurt them before they hurt me. So I'm going to prove they don't really love me. They don't really care about me. So I'm going to throw these things at them, if you will, verbally or physical objects, to prove it, because now they're going to hate me and they're going to not like me and they're not going to be nice to me. And I will say, for the most of our staff, like, that was an aha moment. Like, wait, you want me? It's like, no, they can have a consequence. That's not appropriate behavior. They'll still receive a consequence that's appropriate. But when they come back to school or when you got to try to take the lead and be like, hey, I know that happened, but we're going to be okay. We need to move on. Obviously you scared me. I don't want that to happen again, but I'm still here for you. And it can be that simple. So I'm very proud of that work that we're doing there. Um, we're doing a better job of being compliant with our paperwork and our IEP processes and those things, which I will also argue a compliant IEP doesn't mean the kid's doing well. It means the paperwork was done well. But at the same time, when you take that off your plate and you just have good systems and good processes for that, it makes my staff's job easier, to be there with the kids and support them. So not perfect yet, but we've made some huge strides in that and are doing a better job, with the paperwork process for sure.
Uh, those are all really important. The small things, if you can get them off the table, it just saves time for other areas. So that's a great observation. Tell me a little bit about your Title IX work because that is a unique position. Not every school has advantages of having that. When I was in Blissfield, we had Title IX suits going on while I was there. I actually had a person for the federal government come to me at one point a parent was going to file one on me, and rather than coming to me and going to administration, they went right to the federal government. So I'm somewhat familiar on that end of it. And by the way, there was no issue. I was doing everything fine. But tell me about your Title IX rule and what that entails.
So um, it's it's complex and very challenging for sure. Um, it is supposed to be a very small part of my job. And knock on wood, there can be weeks or months that go by with nothing. Um, but ultimately, my ultimate responsibility is to make sure that we have policies and procedures in place, make sure that we are providing at least a basic level of training to staff, make sure that staff know that if there is something that they have concern about, they know that I'm the person that they can reach out to ask those questions. Putting processes in place where like all of the building administration know, hey, I'm dealing with a student issue and something in the realm of sex in some way, shape, or form comes up. I need to pause for a second and run it by Lon just to make sure, do we have a nope, that while maybe a little bit odd, that's not an unusual behavior for second graders to say or be curious about something. No one was touched, if you will, as icky as that can seem. It can just be addressed. We don't need to open up a Title IX process for that one time incident in something that is developmentally not unusual, if you will, versus a situation where it's like, hey, we have this going on, and through another school district contacting us because there was potentially nude photos of a student on one of your students' phones that didn't happen, not our student, didn't happen in our school, all those things, but we're letting you know that, and the police are going to come and probably need to take those kids' phones. And in that process, the administration going, is there anything on here? Has anyone showed you anything? And a student divulges a completely different horrific scenario that turns into 4.5 months of investigation and expulsions and lawsuits and all kinds of things for me. And so, but if we didn't have processes, that principal could have easily been like, oh, that's weird, and then just moved on. But we've educated them. They've all gone through training, all of that stuff. But it does fall on me for that. And not many people know, like, when I tell people I'm Title IX, they instantly go to like, oh, so when there's like, the boys basketball team gets new uniforms, but the girls basketball team is wearing the uniforms from the 80s, you get involved and make sure they get the same uniforms. I'll be like, technically, yes, that would potentially be a Title IX thing, but no. And so it's more on that line of creating a safe environment, dealing with true sexual harassment, which can include sexual assault or can just include behavior that creates an unsafe environment. And the other part is people don't understand sometimes is it also is staff, because we're a school district, the staff fall under that as far as staff to staff. I mean, I think we automatically assume if there was something inappropriate happening between a staff and a student, that's kind of a no-brainer, that's an issue. But they don't always understand that if a male custodian comes to me and says that another male custodian was sexually harassing them or mocking them or making fun of their gender identity or sexual preferences or any of those things, that's now a Title IX situation that I have to investigate, and I have to tell both parties about their rights. It's super, I can go on for a long time on this. It's super confusing right now, especially in Michigan or in my district, because you have the 2020 regs that the Trump administration came up with, which were really the first formalized regulations around Title IX with detailed processes that you had to follow. And then the Biden administration came out in 2024, or this past spring, with new regulations that made some pretty significant tweaks, not the worst thing ever. In my personal opinion, some improvements as far as making the process a little bit more manageable, at least for K-12. But then there were all these lawsuits. And a federal lawsuit in Colorado that Michigan was not involved in is now impacting districts in Michigan, because if you have students who are members of the Sisters of Liberty, I think is the name of it, I can't remember, they are named and exempt from having to implement the 2024 regulations. And my district and it's not even as a district, it's individual buildings. So my district has 4 buildings, but you imagine a district up the road of Saline or Ann Arbor or any of them that have 6, 7, 8, or Ann Arbor 35 buildings. If a student who's a member of the Sisters of Liberty, I think is what it is, that building cannot investigate any students under the 2024 regs. They have to follow the 2020 regs.
Now I'm curious, and I'm gonna have to look all that stuff up because I had never heard of that. So
It is mind blowing.
um, do you see changes being brought back now that Trump will be back in office?
That is where everyone is leaning. There is an assumption that all of or most of the changes made by the Biden administration will be undone, and that most of it will shift back to the 2020 version. Other than some pieces around protecting gender identity and access, that's the big one. That's the hot button that got the lawsuit. And by access, I mean, for lack of, if anything I say comes across as unpolitically correct or using the wrong term, forgive me, but a biological male participating in female sports type situation or use of locker rooms. That's the crux of what that lawsuit in federal court in Colorado is based on, is that the 2024 regs mandate some of those protections that would say a biologically male student who identifies as a female would need to be able to participate in female sports. All the rest of it, when you compare the 2020 to the 2024 regs, the only significant difference is the 2024 regs, as far as a K-12 school, allow for what we call the single investigator model. So I can be the Title IX coordinator, I can be the investigator, and I can be the decision maker under the 2024 regs. Under the 2020 regs, I can be the Title IX coordinator, but then I can only serve in one of the other 3 roles. I can't serve other multiple roles. And so for our district, under the 2020 regs, I would be the investigator, because that's quite frankly just the harder job and the more time-consuming job. And so I would be the investigator, but whatever I come up with following our processes, our procedures, and all of the federal laws, I would then hand over to someone that gets designated as the decision maker. That decision maker reviews everything that I've submitted, and they determine whether or not the policy was violated. If they determine the policy was violated, they then determine what the consequence should be, whether that's training or expulsion, wherever that falls when you're talking about a student. If it happened to be a staff member, is it training or is it termination? There's an appeals process where either party involved can appeal, and so you have to designate someone else to be the appeals officer. That person reviews everything if it's appealed, and then they either uphold the determination from the decision maker or they send it back to be reinvestigated. And what is actually extremely unique about it is the way you have to create your policy is it dictates that essentially that decision maker level, whatever consequence they decide, is the consequence that has to be done. So for example, if they say this violates the policy and it is so egregious that it meets the definition of needing to be expelled, that student goes in front of the board, and technically the board really doesn't have a lot of voice or choice. They pretty much have to expel. Now, not every policy is written that way, but most of the school's policies across the country are written in such a way because that's what you had to do to meet the 2020 regs. There's also, under the 2020 regs, there is an insane timeline where you have to give everything you even touched as an investigator to both parties And there has to be this 10-day period where you can do nothing else while they review it. And then if they have a question or you need you to look into something and it's legit, you look into it, give the evidence, and the 10 days starts over again. And then the decision maker gets to make a decision, and then there's 10 more days. And so, I mean, you could have a Title IX investigation last 6, 7, 8 months. And that whole time, you can't discipline anyone until you're done with the investigation.
Well, obviously, this is a very important role, and you have it down. Hopefully, just not because of all the experiences you had to deal with, but your knowledge of that is tremendous. I didn't know half the things you were saying. Um, but again, I've been out of that realm for such a long time, and it was started in sports. So to have that flower out into, the general school population is and work population and everything else is what
Yeah,
most people don't even know is part of that process. So I'm glad you
yeah,
brought that up. So anybody looking for an expert, you can contact Lon and he'll be happy for a cost to help you out.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's your next career. All right. So wow, we're getting close to that time already. So how do you see the future of special education playing out? Do you see any trends in how we teach, the approaches, technology? What are some of the things that you sort of think will happen here in the near future?
I think pretty much universally in education right now, talking with colleagues in the area across the state, behavior has become just a huge, huge thing. I also know like it's very common for every generation to kind of say that about the generation behind them, like, right? But it's not even that. I worry about some of that, but it's more just behavior. And really, I long for the day that we can stop blaming the pandemic for things. But realistically, I will keep pointing to that because at the time when the first few years out of the pandemic and we were doing things, we were trying really hard to address that learning loss that happened. 100% happened. There's no way to deny it. Anyone that says that it didn't is lying. And it unequally impacted students, right? Socioeconomically disadvantaged students were so much more impacted by it than our families that had means and they were able to pivot and make adjustments and provide stable home life for those students. But we thought, you know, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, when the pandemic happened, in the year 2020, we thought those were the students that were going to be the most impacted because those are such critical years for learning and developing and social skills and all of those things. And things were so weird for them that we thought that's the big impact. And the reality is what we're finding is it's they were impacted and we were able to recoup academically. There's still behavior things, but we were able to recoup academically. The students that were born in the pandemic or 9 months old or 1 year old that are now kindergartners are so impacted more than we ever thought. And it's little things where you go talk to a kindergartner or a first grader, and there are many of them in all different economic situations who have never been to a grocery store. Because what happened in the pandemic? We all ordered everything we wanted from Amazon because those poor Amazon and UPS guys still had to work. We did, Instacart. We did, click and pick up or whatever you want to call it from the grocery stores. People weren't allowed to go into grocery stores, but still needed food. So you went online and you filled out your grocery list for the week. You drove up, opened the back end of your car, someone threw your stuff in, and you drove home. And you might think, ooh, and I think back to when my kids were super little, and like myself or my wife would have loved to not take 3 small children into the grocery store for an hour and a half and have to entertain them up and down the aisles and deal with meltdowns and all those things. But I always look at that as a really good example of that's a social experience. That's being out. People stopped going out to eat and still choose not to go out to eat as much because why would I? If I'm in an area that has it, I've got, Grubhub, all of those different options where food can just anything. It's not It's not pizza and Chinese food back when we were kids that can be delivered. You can get anything you want on the entire spectrum of food delivered to your house. So why get in my car and drive? Why take my small children that aren't easy to manage in a restaurant and take them to a restaurant and have to manage and deal with all that when they can just stay at home and the food will come to us? And so it created this environment where these children just didn't experience any natural social settings. And truly, some parents, they were first time parents, or all of their children were young. So they didn't have to learn how to say no and how to control their child in a social setting. And I'm really not trying to blame parents, but there's a part where they parented different. And then when they turn 5 years old, they bring them to school and say, here you go. And they're with us for 7.5 hours. And they've never been told to sit down while they eat. They've never been told, no, you can't throw your food when you don't like it. I mean, there's just little things that when you think of like, oh, I'm at home, I'm stressed out, it's not worth the battle to fight with my kid. And I'm okay with that in your home, but there was never a time in their life where that ever was a requirement. And then they come to school and they don't know how to sit. They they don't understand when someone says, go to the sink and wash your hands, do you need to go to the bath? It's all of these things that they're just so overstimulated by the school environment. And truly, people, right, wrong, or indifferent, they throw technology in front of their children to entertain them. And it happens. I understand. But they're not understanding that effect that has on their ability to focus on anything but a flashing, constantly moving, constantly giving me instant feedback situation. So sit and wait your turn for a minute while I help Johnny before I come over to you, Joey. It's an eternity because they're used to, I click a button and I get the next thing I want. And so that is huge. And to get off of what sounds like I'm blaming parents for a second, we're no longer new. This isn't 2021. We have known this for years. Education has to change. We have to educate children differently, understanding that they're coming to us differently. And we're just not there yet. We're trying, but it's not fully grasped that we need to focus on those things before we worry about the academics, because no child who's dysregulated has ever learned anything. And so until we figure out how to help them be regulated, they're not going to learn basic reading, writing, and math. And so I think that is culmination of those two things is what's probably the biggest obstacle right now in education.
That's a question I get quite a bit is how do we engage this generation better than what we have in the past. And when you go in and observe a classroom that is still that more traditional lecture type situation or direct instruction, and they're not doing anything that's active, you're setting yourself up. So how do we maintain organization and a classroom environment that's a learning environment and still have the kids be able to do those other things that are needed to let them be kids? And that's the balance we're trying to strike right now in education. And it is tough, especially if you have multiple years under your belt. It's hard to change your order of operation, but at some point, either you do it or it's just going to pass you by.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Our time is up, Lon. We've been at it for an hour. Um, I have to say that I don't know if you're a fan of Simon Sinek or not, but he talks about the infinite game. Have you heard that?
No.
Well, there's two types of games. The finite game, which is like your sports where there's given rules and given time frames. There's this infinite game that just always goes on. Education is an infinite game.
Yeah.
So how do you measure an infinite game's winner and loser? You don't. Either you're doing well or you're not. The infinite game is to stay in the game. So you are the reason that I can say my infinite game has been somewhat successful because listening to you talk, I no longer see the eighth grade boy sitting in my classroom. I see a man that understands his position really well and is very knowledgeable in the field that he's in. So I know I'm not the reason you're there, but I'm happy I was on the path that got you to that point, or it got to meet you on the path at least. How about we put it that way? But I do appreciate your time, and everything that you stated today was spot on, and your knowledge is tremendous. So I appreciate everything you're doing there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity to share some of it, and just, it's always good to be able to talk about the work we do. It's not, education in general isn't glamorous, if you will, and then you kind of get into the field that I've dedicated my career to, of special ed, and it's even trickier because it's misunderstood and labeled in the wrong way many times. But it's such important work, and I've always advocated that if you put something in place that would help a student with a disability be successful, the odds are many other students will be successful because of that, right? It's one of my favorite cartoons is the shot of, the snow-covered steps and ramp at a school and a student in a wheelchair saying, "Can you clear the ramp?" And the custodian or whoever, not to ill place them, but the person shoveling the snow, saying, "I'll shovel the ramp as soon as I'm done shoveling the steps for all these other students." And the student wisely cracks back, "Well, if you clear the ramp, we can all go in, right? It's not like the ramp is only for the student in the
Right.
wheelchair." And so that I go to that a lot in my mind, if you will, and share that sometimes of like some of the things we do in special education are super beneficial for all students. And so try to advocate for those things on a regular basis.
And I will add on to that. When you had me as a teacher, that was my first year. I knew absolutely nothing about teaching really. Um, but to know that I had a fully inclusive classroom the whole time I was there without an aide, you do start universally designing things to make sure that everybody can have some success in your classroom, and it just becomes second nature. And that's why I
Yeah,
think when I hear people struggling with it, I'm going, well, why are you struggling? I don't understand.
yeah,
But that exposure young as a teacher really does help you understand the bigger picture.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with
Well,
that completely.
well, I'd like to thank Lon for our discussion today. Lon is an incredible educator and even a better person. Thank you for the work that you do. Please remember to subscribe, not describe. Don't describe my channel. Please remember to subscribe to Educational Norm channel and contact me for information on my work or my guest information at norm@normpotter.com or visit my website, structuredcreativityconsulting.com. And until next time, be kind, be professional, and find solutions. Thank you very much, Lon.
Thank you.